I want to just make sure that I'm coming through. Can you hear me now? We'll see if the internet can hear me. Hello, hello. Testing 1, 2, 3. Check 1, 2. Okay. There we go. Check 1, 2. Testing 1, 2, 3. If you guys are online, if you would let me know whether you can hear me or not. It's hard to tell. Check 1, 2. All right, we're good. Okay. Well, as we get going, we are going to, I'm not only speaking to you all in the room, but I'm also speaking to our friends who may be joining us online. We have a few folks I see who have jumped online, and those who will join us after the live video. But so I'm going to be giving some instructions as we kind of go along, that some of them will pertain to you and some of them won't. But if you're joining us online and over the course of our conversation you have a question that you'd like to ask and you're on Facebook, you can just put that right in the comments below, and we will do our best to try and answer those questions in an efficient amount of time. So if you have a question, throw it in there. If you're on the live stream and you want to just give us a hi, hey, how you doing? We'd love to see you, just so we can get a sense of who's online with us. But we also, you can use our prayer email address, BrightonUMCprayers. You can see it in the little box there at the bottom. If you have a question, you send it in there. We'll check my email before we close up today to make sure we've answered questions. But we're going to go ahead and settle in here. We're going to do our best to keep this as brief as we can, but there's a lot of detail going on. The inspiration for our gathering was really in that some of our leadership has been meeting about these issues for some time now. But it was mentioned sort of offhand in a meeting, and someone said, well, I didn't realize that was still going on or was back going on, so we might need an update. So this is our effort to give an update. If you've read our broadcaster, you can find that online too. If you don't get our broadcaster in your inbox, you can sign up to get that, but it's on our website as well. The broadcaster article that I wrote for this sort of June-July issue of the broadcaster has some detail about some of what's been going on. But just to kind of go back and review just a little bit about kind of what, if maybe you're new to our congregation or new to United Methodism and you're wondering what you got yourself into, there's been a long, well, the United Methodist Church was formed in the coming together of two denominations in 1968. And as soon as we formed and said amen, I think we started fighting about things. Go figure, right? So for more than 50 years, we have been embroiled in lots of controversy, much of which is surrounding the issues of sexuality in the church, and particularly in the clergy, and what that looks like. So if you'd like a more detailed description of how some of that has unfolded, we'll find another time to do that. But we had been keeping folks up to speed on a lot that had been going on. It had been accelerating in the last, now 6 years or so. In 2016, Bishop Oliveto was elected. Bishop Oliveto is married to her wife and is now the bishop of our conference, and has been now for 6 years. And they're just now getting around to doing jurisdictional conference and electing more bishops, but it's very likely that she will continue our bishop, at least in the short term. But her election and appointment here sort of brought that everything kind of to the forefront. It had been sort of happening once every 4 years. We get together and fight and argue and vote, and then we move on, or we try to move on anyway. But this has sort of put things on the front burner. So it sort of set us down the path toward what do we do and where does our denomination go. Well, the one answer to that question emerged right before the pandemic in January of 2020. It was announced that a group of varied, a very diverse group of people from across our denomination, from the most progressive to the most traditional and everybody in between, came together, including bishops and key leaders, with a world-renowned negotiator to sort of hammer out what it might look like to formally separate in some way. What would it look like for the United Methodist Church to create a graceful opportunity for churches who wanted to leave, and then to continue on. So what they came up with was something that was called, it's very Methodist of them, it was called the Protocol for Reconciliation and Grace Through Separation. Yeah, that's very Methodist for you, right? It doesn't have an acronym, not that I'm aware of, but anyway, the protocol, it's shorthanded as the protocol, essentially. And what it essentially did was, were it to be passed by General Conference, it would have established an opportunity for churches throughout the world, Methodist churches throughout the world, and whole conferences could vote to leave the United Methodist Church and to create a new traditional Methodist denomination. And there were some financial pieces there, but the basics were that any church could leave with their property. Now, this is an interesting and sticky issue with this whole fight that's going on, is that the United Methodist Church has something that's shorthanded as the trust clause. The trust clause, in short, is that all of our physical and financial assets, our building, all of our equipment, all of our bank accounts, everything is held in trust by our annual conference, the Mountain Sky Annual Conference. We own it. We have responsibility for upkeeping it, and the members of this congregation have generously contributed to that over 126 years now. But it's held in trust by the denomination, essentially, which means that we couldn't just say, change the sign out front and declare ourselves to be some different Methodist church. We are tied into the United Methodist Church legally, essentially, by our physical buildings. And so, obviously, a church could, a whole group of people, we're not controlled by the United Methodist Church as people, so we could go form another church, but we would have to basically we'd have to start over and abandon our facilities and our bank accounts and all that. So, obviously, that's a problem. The people of this church have supported, and people of churches all across our country and our world, in fact, have supported their congregations for 3 centuries now, well, 2.5 centuries. So there's this problem of the trust clause. How do we work around that? The protocol would have provided an opportunity for a church to take a vote. It set a threshold, and it would have been, then a church could take all of their assets and move to the new denomination if they wanted, or they could stay in what was called the post-separation UMC, name to be determined, right? New denomination, name to be determined at the time. And then, anyway, they came out with this protocol January of 2022, or January of 2020. And as you may recall, something very significant happened around March of 2020 when the coronavirus made its presence known in America, and everything pretty much ground to a halt. Well, that was unfortunate timing, because the General Conference that has the authority to vote on the protocol was scheduled to meet at the end of April and early May of 2020. Because of the pandemic, obviously that didn't happen. They postponed the General Conference gathering. The General Conference, if you're not familiar, is a gathering of elected delegates from conferences across the world. So we're bringing in people from the Philippines and Africa and England and Eastern Europe and Russia and from all over to the United States. Usually, we've never done it outside the United States, but it was supposed to be in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so they were all traveling to Minnesota to make these decisions, and that is the only body that has the authority to speak for the entire denomination, is the General Conference. So they're the body that has to deal with something like the protocol. And it was largely received as an unfortunate but necessary sort of step. It was sort of like, okay, let's agree to part peacefully rather than fight each other to the death. And there seemed to be a lot of hope gathered around that. But with the postponement of General Conference, that obviously delayed decisions, and we all, every congregation, at least in America, but across the world, launched into how do we continue to worship during COVID. And we did. We found ways to do that, but it consumed all of our time. And it kind of put this squabbling in the denomination kind of on the back burner. But it was rescheduled. The conference meeting was rescheduled for late August of 2021, so it would have been last August. And around February of 2021, they looked at the global landscape, and vaccines were promising, but not out widely enough, especially in the world. And so they decided they needed to postpone it again. So they did. They rescheduled it for the first week in September of this year, 2022. And with things opening up, as I'm sure you have seen, things are nothing is completely normal because COVID, but many things are getting back to normal. Our worship is getting much more back to normal. And so the hope was that we would be able to meet, protocol would pass, and we could move on with whatever congregation was going to do. And we got word in early March of this year that the Commission on the General Conference is, you need a bingo card for this meeting, I think, to keep track of all these things. But the Commission on the General Conference, which is the body in charge of putting the meeting on, it's a 1,000-person meeting dealing with multiple translations. It's a lot of logistics to put the meeting on. So they have this big committee that their only purpose is to put on the meeting. They came out with an announcement that they were going to postpone it now, not for a year, but for 2 years. Normally, the General Conference meets every 4 years. So we're supposed to meet in 2020. The next scheduled meeting would be 2024. They decided that they were going to postpone it until that next meeting. It didn't make sense to have a meeting in the middle. So they announced they were going to postpone it, and they blamed vaccine availability and visa issues with international delegates. Well, after that decision was made, there were several people who raised alarm bells about the decision-making process, and one clergy person even resigned from the committee in disgust, exposing the fact that, in his estimation anyway, the decision was made poorly and was not really based on coronavirus, but more a desire to impede the passing of the protocol. And so it's become increasingly clear over the last 3 months that forces in the established denomination, they are sort of working together to prevent the protocol from passing. So that creates problems, obviously, for churches that are struggling with where we are. If you're not familiar with the United Methodist Church and its positions, the Book of Discipline, which is our formal guiding document, which governs our polity, our way of doing church, states that that all people are of sacred worth and are valuable to God, but that the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. And the way that gets expressed is that we are not allowed by discipline to bless same-sex weddings. And at least in the Book of Discipline, the language is self-avowed practicing homosexuals are not allowed to be clergy, are not allowed to be ordained. Pardon me. And so the book says one thing, but as I began the meeting by saying in 2016, we received a bishop who is married to another woman, a woman married to another woman. So obviously there's some misalignment with practice and the discipline. So that's causing a lot of issues, and enforcement of all of that is kind of at the heart of all of these problems. So when it came out, the General Conference was going to be postponed again, and it seemed clear that folks in the denomination had thought throughout the pandemic, thought twice about supporting the protocol. Then it became formalized. some centrist and progressive signers of the protocol agreement that established the protocol as an option or as a potential option, that have now distanced themselves and have renounced their support for the protocol, making it even more uncertain whether it would pass or not. There are some vote counters out there who think it might pass in 2024, assuming we have a meeting, but no one's certain. Because of that, and because there had been a lot of rancor in the last several years, the denomination that was being set up to be that traditional denomination, should the protocol pass, obtained a name, the Global Methodist Church, and they prepared all of the documents and everything that they would need to formally launch as a denomination, and in preparation for the protocol. And when the meeting got postponed again this past March, the decision was made to go ahead and launch the Global Methodist Church without the protocol. That was made for a couple of reasons. One, so they launched officially on May 1st of this past year, so just a couple months ago. And that decision was made for a couple reasons. One, more than 200 churches had left the denomination using over the course of the previous 4 or 5 years, using a provision that was adopted in 2019. I guess it's only been 3 years. 2019, there was a special general conference that was supposed to sort of settle this issue once and for all, and it did nothing but rile everything up and make everybody mad, essentially. And so they passed at that 2019 gathering, they passed a provision that became paragraph 2553 in the Book of Discipline, for you legal nerds out there. But paragraph 2553 basically states that a church objecting to the policies or the implementation of the discipline around human sexuality could vote to leave the denomination with some provisions. And be released of the trust clause with some provisions. The most significant of which is an apportioned amount of the unfunded pension liability for the annual conference. The annual conference is a sponsor for the pension plan for all of our clergy. And so if we were to leave, our ability to help in covering the cost of that pension program would be eliminated. And so it was determined that we would owe some portion of unfunded pension liability. We would owe current years of the church that wanted to leave would owe a current year's apportionments in full and one future year worth of apportionments based on the previous year. So basically 2 years of apportionments and unfunded pension liability. We'll get to what that means in real dollars in a minute. But that's that, and it left, of course, this rather small wording that has a huge difference, and that is other requirements as determined by the annual conference. So there are basic provisions that are required, and then there are annual conferences could add other things onto that. Well, some churches had become so frustrated with their situation that they had already left, and about 200 churches had left between the 2019, when the provision became the rule, and the launch of the Global Methodist Church. Mostly smaller churches, but some larger churches that managed to leave at great cost to themselves, but they made that choice. So there were already former United Methodist churches that were kind of hanging out there that could potentially be looking for a home, a place to connect again as a denomination. And there is another provision in the discipline, which we won't get into a lot, but that will allow churches to transfer from the UMC to another Pan-Methodist evangelical denomination. So the Global Methodist Church launches as a possible Pan-Methodist evangelical denomination that a church could theoretically be transferred to if the bishop and the cabinet agree, essentially. So it provided a secondary way for churches to also make their way to the GMC. And in the wake of a third postponement and further discouragement about whether they would even have an option, many churches have started the process of looking into what it would cost and how to go through that process to leave. So it really made sense for the Global Methodist Church to be a home for any churches that left, so that they wouldn't just kind of be orphaned out into the universe. So Global Methodist Church launched, and in May, and as I said, many churches have started seeking, at least to explore the possibility of what it would take to leave the denomination. So I'm going to pause for just a moment and check. I don't see anything on Facebook. Oh, got some here. Okay, just some people on. All right, hello everybody online. Let me just see here. Sorry, I'm multitasking. There we go. Okay, I had you guys far away, but hopefully you could hear me. So anyway, that's sort of what brought us to this point. Now the pandemic is kind of waning, at least in our sort of disruption of everyday lives, and this has kind of reemerged as a big issue. One other complicating factor is that the provision that allows for churches to leave, when it was adopted with a sunset date. And the sunset date is December 31st of 2023. So if you don't have a good mental calendar in your mind, that is approximately 6 months before the General Conference would be scheduled to meet again. So if a church wanted to leave, they would only really have until December 31st of 2023 to do it. And then beyond that, there would be no guarantee that they would have even the option. There's no guarantee that the protocol will pass. It may or may not. It seems discouraging to me, but not hopeless, assuming that they gather in 2024. But at the very least, the General Conference would not be obligated to pass a sort of re-upping of this provision at 2024. So churches are left in kind of this bind. If they're dissatisfied with the denomination as it's been sort of going along, they're left with the decision of, well, we can either wait for 2024 and see if we get a better deal, but we might not get any deal, or we could try to find the financial wherewithal to leave before 2023 ends, and could go independent, could go into the Global Methodist Church, but that's sort of the place churches are at if they're upset with what's going on in the denomination. I'm going to pause for just a moment before we get into some more weeds and just see if there are any questions about all of that. Yeah?
Why are they so interested in determining gay people from going to church, or being able to participate in church? Because there's a lot of good people that are gay, that are very Christian. I have a granddaughter who's gay, and she's very Christian. So why is it such a big deal where it has to explode into all these churches?
Well, that's an interesting question, and probably more than I could get into in great depth here. But to be clear, the United Methodist Church does not bar anybody from participation in a church, in worship. I would not. No, I would not. Yes, Brenda. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to dodge that question because it's an important one, and it's a serious one that we've talked in different settings around here throughout this whole process. Just to respond just a little bit, and then to say that this is an infinitely more complicated subject than we can get into in our little update here. But the position of the United Methodist Church is that, related to human sexuality, is that none of this is an issue of salvation. None of this is an issue of salvation. So the United Methodist Church begins its portion talking about human sexuality in general, all human sexuality, as in the context of all of us being of sacred worth. We are all created in the image of God. We are all of sacred worth. And it gets into a lot of, this subject gets into a lot of issues because of the way the church has responded in bad ways and in un-Christ-like ways to this issue and others. But for the sake of our conversation here, this is really limited to the denomination as a whole says this is how we're going to govern ourselves. And there are large portions of the denomination that are saying we're not going to follow that, and there's nothing you can do to stop us. So it's, for me, it's that there are a lot of complications with the issues of sexuality. There's a lot of complexity to that in our culture as well as in our church, and I don't want to minimize that by trying to give you a half-baked short answer here today. But the real problem, as I see it, is not the church's response to human sexuality so much as it is the fact that we have a complete lack of ability to agree about how we're going to move forward, if that makes sense. And some have decided that's their open door to do whatever they want to do, apart from accountability. So we actually have a fault in the system, if you will. What happens is the people who are in charge of enforcing the rules of our denomination and sort of implementing them, if you will, are basically ignoring their obligation to do that. But there's nobody and no entity in the church that has any authority to sort of hold them accountable to that. So what we have is really sort of a conflict of process that has melted down, essentially, that is causing a lot of dysfunction in the system. And if we could agree one way or the other and just, implement and hold each other accountable to that, then that would be good. Because then people would know where they stand. But like, for example, I often tell people that we had a gal come into the church looking for information about BSF this week, and she wanted to know about Methodism. And she wanted, what is a Methodist? And so I got to give my 1-minute elevator speech to a total stranger. What is a Methodist, right? And then she said, and that's what I'd find in every Methodist church. And I had to qualify it by saying, not so much. It's what you'll find here, but it's not necessarily what you'd find in other Methodist churches, because the ability to hold each other accountable to our agreed upon way of being church is breaking down, essentially.
Are they going to take votes from the congregations to make a decision before they do? Can you repeat the questions?
Yes, absolutely.
Go ahead.
So for our folks at home, she's asking if they're going to take votes in the churches before they, of the members, with the congregations, before they decide what to do. So the way our system works is it's kind of for better or for worse, the Methodist Church and the United States were born around the same time, and they kind of adopted the same way of functioning. So if you're familiar with our civil sort of government, this will sound kind of familiar. But basically, we elect delegates that go on to make decisions, essentially. So I go and we have a layperson from our church who goes to annual conference, which is our regional body, and that body elects our delegates to general conference and jurisdictional conference, and those bodies make these decisions. So it's kind of up the food chain, if you will.
People then instead of leaving it up to those few selected individuals.
It could, yeah, that would be helpful. The theory, of course, is the same theory behind you voting for your congressperson and them voting, up the food chain for what they believe their constituents would do. So it's kind of one of those. Right. Yeah, and it is as dysfunctional as our civil government as you can imagine. Yeah, it's so. I often tell people that have you heard this quote? I can't remember who it is. Maybe some of you historians will know. But there's a quote by one of the founding fathers, I think, that says, democracy is the worst possible way to make decisions except for all the rest. So that's kind of where we're at. And so there's been a lot of frustration. So when it comes to the issues, particularly around the sexuality stuff, if you're interested in more of that, I would be happy to sit down and talk about that, and we can set up another gathering to kind of dig into those issues more deeply. But I'm just wanting to make sure that we're updated on kind of where we are and what that means for us. So the other question, sort of a side thing to what you were asking, is churches will be allowed to voice their decision one way or the other if they want. We can take a vote if we want, and we can get into the details of that, what that might look like. But so we do have some voting power that's more local. It's sort of like your county government, if you will, in our analogy there. But we'll just have to kind of see where that takes us. Dave, you had a question? Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so Dave's question is about the Global Methodist Church that launched and what their connection to the UMC would be and others. So the Global Methodist Church is entirely independent. Their leadership is made up, I believe, I can't say this for certain, but their leadership is made up, I believe, of all former United Methodists, but they are not beholden to the General Conference at all. They are a completely independent denomination. To give you some background, the groundwork was laid for the Global Methodist Church by another group called the Wesleyan Covenant Association. And just full disclosure, I've been a member of the Wesleyan Covenant Association since its founding in 2016. That group has been working toward the establishment of a new denomination with the hopes of renewing the United Methodist Church, but with an eye toward, if we can't do that, then could we set up a new denomination and go with that. By the way, if you're not familiar with the recent history of the Protestant church, especially in America, we are the third or fourth denomination, probably the fourth denomination to go through this controversy. The Presbyterian Church has been through it, Presbyterian USA. The Episcopal Church was the first. They launched into it and are still embroiled in many legal battles over buildings and such. So the Presbyterians went through it. I know there was a Lutheran. I'm not familiar with all the strains of Lutheranism, but I know that there's at least one Lutheran denomination who's gone through it, and now us. The interesting political reality of the United Methodist Church is that it started in the U.S. with international missionaries that went to places like Africa and the Philippines and Korea and other places, and then their mission work was so productive and so successful that the United Methodist Church in Africa, as we heard from our visitor today, has exploded to the point that their growth is the African growth is outpacing American decline. And let me tell you, American churches in the United Methodist Church are declining quickly. So they're growing so fast that they're outpacing our decline. And so the United Methodist Church on paper is still growing, and in Africa it definitely is growing, but it's growing so fast that it's outpacing the growth in America, which has meant that the African delegations to General Conference have grown in size, and they are coming from a different cultural context than 21st century America. So that has been, if we would have taken a vote in, say, 1975 on this issue, we probably would have been the first denomination off the diving board into this controversy. But fast forward 50 years, and we're one of the last because of that international growth. The Presbyterian USA Church they have Presbyterian churches outside of the U.S., but their denomination is limited to the U.S., so their decision-making is here. Same with the Episcopal Church is the Anglican Communion in America, if that makes sense. So there's lots of weird political factors that have kept the UMC kind of embroiled in this fight much longer than anybody observing would have expected.
Do they allow any of the congregations to go to some of these meetings to listen in on them so they can hear a different point of view than what was censored that they want us to send to already?
Yeah, so interesting question. She's asking if people could go to these meetings to find out what's going on. Unfortunately, we haven't been meeting because of the pandemic, and that's been really the issue. But all of the General Conference meetings, when they happen, are now, thanks to technology, live streamed for all to see. If you really want to cure your insomnia, that's a great way to do it. Let me tell you, it's not as riveting as it sounds. It's a little bit like watching C-SPAN. But you can observe it, and
Negotiations, it's not an easy process, and it can
no,
be hard.
yeah, and it's people standing up, petitions, Robert's Rules of Order. So if you're familiar with that sort of thing, that's kind of the look of it. But
I'd be more than happy to participate if you needed to.
mhm,
I wanted to.
mhm. Mm-hmm. No. Yep. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. So the purpose of this meeting is really information. It's since this has happened, there have been people who have left our congregation, quite honestly, because of the controversies on both sides. And they've had very frank conversations with me about it. And some haven't. Some have just disappeared, and I've followed up with them. But we haven't, not too many, but there have been some who have left on both sides. There are many who have come to me privately and expressed concerns, and there are many in meetings like this who have publicly expressed concerns on both sides. I've been clear with the congregation the whole time where I live on these issues, and I'd be glad to visit with anybody about why I live where I live and how I got there, because it's been a very long and strange journey. But when it comes to this, when it comes to the future of our congregation in the midst of the future of this denomination, my job here is really to inform. I've told this to folks, whatever decision this congregation makes about whatever future it wants and wherever it wants to be. The nature of our denomination is that while we are partnered in ministry, we have differences. I am appointed by the conference, so I am technically not a member of our congregation. I am a member of the Mountain Sky Annual Conference as an ordained elder. And this church has been a participating congregation in the Mountain Sky, previous Rocky Mountain, etc., going back 126 years. And so me and all of my predecessors have been members of the conference that sent us here. My job is not to make the decision for you, or even to force you to make a decision one way or the other, or to drive away people who would make a different decision than I. My role here as your leader has been to inform and to give you all of the information so you know what's happening, and to try and pastor you through this so that you guys can make whatever decision you want to make about that. We both have decisions to make ultimately. And so that's sort of been my role. My role is, but we've been on pause because of COVID. So we're kind of reconstituting this process of my helping to inform you about what's going on and give you my best advice based on what I see happening. I am unfortunately a total denominational nerd, so I probably know more about this than I should. And so I've tried to keep you as informed as you want to be about this. And that's partly because I look around at colleagues and I look around at churches not far from us who are completely in the dark about what's going on. And when things start to fall apart in more obvious ways, there are going to be questions that are going to have a lot more discussion than we'll have to do. And that started to happen. So since the Global Methodist Church launched on May 1st, there have been a series of annual conferences that have met. Our annual conference just met a week and a half ago. I met with them on Zoom. They did sort of a hybrid thing, so I met with them on Zoom. And so our annual conference met. There have been annual conferences across the country that have been meeting. It's annual conference season, basically May to early July is annual conference season in the U.S. And it takes a vote of the annual conference for a church to leave the denomination. So we're getting news now about more churches that have made the decision to leave. The most significant was the 70 churches that voted to leave the North Georgia annual conference back in late May. So 70 churches representing, I think if I remember right, 13% of their churches and membership, and about 9% of their, no, it was 13% of their churches, like 9% of their membership, left the North Georgia annual conference and joined with the Global Methodist Church. So you're starting to see that kind of crop up, and if people haven't been informed about what's going on, they might go, well, why are churches leaving like that? That doesn't make any sense. So my job has been to inform. So that's a great clarification. Thank you, Brenda, for asking that. Dave?
I just have one more question. Churches that are leaving, are they leaving because of the general procrastination, or are they leaving because of the protocol?
So I can't speak to all of them. My sense of the churches that are leaving are that they're leaving because of the procrastination, by and large. I don't know as though that's universal. There may be churches that are leaving because they're frustrated for well, it might be the delay, but they might be frustrated for wanting to just leave and leave this behind. So it's I would say probably mostly the delay and the concern that the protocol wouldn't pass, essentially. That these are churches that were likely prepared to leave if the protocol were to pass. They would leave and join the new denomination, but are deciding to leave now rather than wait and see if the protocol passes, essentially. But it's possible that churches are leaving for other reasons too. I just haven't heard of any. John?
What determines the size, I guess you'd say, of the council? Does it determine on the, you say you and one lay, does it determine on the size of the church? Or does it determine, like you say, there's one greatly in Africa,
Mm-hmm.
or greatly Korea,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
what determines the size of the representation?
So John's asking what determines the size of representation at General Conference, and the answer to that is apportioned delegates by population. So just to kind of put that into context, I haven't gone to General Conference. I went in 2012 as a backup delegate, but I attend annual conference, and one of our lay people will attend annual conference, is allowed to every year. And that's determined by the number of pastors that are at your church. So for every appointed clergy person you have, you get one lay person to also represent you. So it's equal. So the representation at annual conference is theoretically supposed to be equal clergy and laity. Clergy are a little stranger, so they tend to be a little bit higher in that, even though there are ways of balancing that. But that's annual conference, and then they elect delegates to general conference. Those delegates are apportioned based on our population, not population of potential, but population of actual members. So what that means for the Mountain Sky Conference is we are allowed 2 clergy and 2 laity to general conference. So we get 4 delegates from our conference to represent us at general conference. We used to get, in the old Rocky Mountain Conference, we used to get 3 clergy and 3 laity, so we were 6. And Yellowstone Annual Conference, with whom we've now merged, they used to get the minimum 1 and 1. And so between the two conferences, we had 4 and 4, so 6 or 8 total. And when I went in 2012, we had 8. But as the population in the United Methodist Church in the U.S. has shrunk, the share of delegates from the U.S. in general has shrunk with it. And it was actually, this is sort of interesting, it was actually projected as early as 2012 that Africa's number of delegates would outpace the U.S. by 2024. So by next year, it's expected that the African conferences will have more delegates than the U.S. conferences will. But everything's upset by some churches are leaving. So you may have heard the Bulgarian United Methodist conference. The whole conference voted to leave the United Methodist Church and have now joined with the Global Methodist Church. So there are some international bodies that are starting to realign. And depending on how they realign and churches that leave and all of those vote counters that are above my pay grade. But that's sort of the, so as just to demonstrate how that has, the population shift has shrunk our presence at general conferences. We used to be 4 and 4, so 8 total, and now we're 4 total. So we're half the size we were just 10 years ago in our delegation. And I haven't seen what our apportioned delegates would be. They get announced, usually it's 2 years before a general conference, so they should be announced here shortly because we'll elect delegates next year at annual conference for the 2024 conference, theoretically. If they have it, yeah. Brenda.
I'm trying to get information about what's happening in the world. Are the areas of growth, and I think the word is progressive,
Mm-hmm.
towards being more open to gay and lesbian participation as leadership in the church? As far as that is concerned, is that as growth in Africa and the places that are growing so rapidly more institutional, historical? What the conference is saying at this
Mhm.
time? Or is it moving more towards liberal?
Mm-hmm.
What is happening?
Sure, so Brenda's,
Understand where the changes
Mhm.
are leading globally compared to where we are here.
Sure, so Brenda's asking about that shift in population growth in the denomination and where they sort of fit on the issues that are presenting themselves to the denomination. So by and large, obviously they could speak for themselves, but by and large, the African and the Filipino and some of the other international delegations tend to be very much more traditional minded. They tend to be much more in line with the traditional positions of the church on these issues. While at the same time in America, the American church has become more progressive, honestly, as a whole. The denomination has remained in this sort of homeostasis, if you will, because as we've gotten more, as the United States members have gotten more progressive, their influence has gotten smaller, and so it's been sort of this kind of weird sort of historical shift, but yeah, the international delegates overwhelmingly tack in a more traditional historical church position on this issue, and others. Mm-hmm. Any other questions, John?
Another question. Steve, where does the global Methodist, where do they stand on the gays or irregularities or whatever?
Mm-hmm. So the Global Methodist Church, all of their documents, by the way, if you want to search up the Global Methodist Church, you can look at all of their transitional doctrines and discipline. And then there will be a meeting of the Global Methodist Church in the next 18 months to 2 years to convene and formally adopt their documents for where they would stand on this. But they're formed as a traditional alternative to the UMC, sort of functionally moving in a progressive way, if that makes sense. So the UMC hasn't formally moved in a progressive situation regarding issues of sexuality, but the practice in large parts of the U.S. has moved in that way without accountability to the rest of the denomination, if that makes sense. So the Global Methodist Church is set up as an alternative to that. It would be a traditional, it would be more in line with where the African and other international folks would be. So basically it's set up as a traditional denomination that would define marriage and human sexuality in more traditional terms. What's the difference?
Well, we heard Joel was that, yeah, I think you misspoke, yeah, they're establishing as an alternative to the United Methodist Church,
Mm-hmm.
becoming more progressive, so they're going historically conservative,
Yes.
but they're moving more progressive, that's what we heard.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, that's not what I meant. So the United Methodist Church is going more progressive, in practice at least, if not formally. The Global Methodist Church will have a traditional position on marriage and sexuality, as well as a lot of other things that sort of rethink how we do church as a denomination. They're not completely throwing out what we've learned over hundreds of years of being the Methodist denomination, but they're also not. So just to give you some idea, there would be no trust clause in the Global Methodist Church, which is what is holding us here, is the trust clause with the United Methodist Church. So there would be no trust clause, meaning if you didn't like where the Global Methodist Church was going, then you could leave it with all your assets. They're yours. They are talking about term limits for bishops. So rather than having bishops elected to lifetime terms, they would be elected for a season, somewhere between 8 and 12 years, and then they would rotate back into serving in a local church. And there would be issues with what am I trying to say? If you know anything about the structure of the United Methodist Church, it's become kind of a giant elephant on the backs of its local congregations. And though it does some good things, it probably is very inefficient. I don't think I'm going out on a limb by saying they're inefficient in doing things. And so the Global Methodist Church in its design would be to be much less top-heavy and more empowering. Anything that is above the local church would be with the express purpose of empowering the local church to do ministry. So a little bit of a reframe, but theologically and doctrinally that would be much more aligned with the traditional Christian understanding of sexuality in the church. Mel?
What I understand a lot of this is, we have a basic issue with accountability, as in these, not just our bishop, but many of the other churches and the conferences
Mhm.
around general conference are just doing what they want to do with no accountability. Is that going to be solved in the Global Methodist Church?
Yes. Yes. So so Mel's asking about accountability. Will the issues of accountability that we found in the United Methodist Church currently be resolved in the Global Methodist Church? And the short answer is yes. That layers of accountability will be implemented to make sure that those things are dealt with. Right. Yep. And of course, right now the Global Methodist Church is under a transitional doctrines and disciplines, so they've kind of got temporary rules to sort of place hold while they establish, and then they're going to hold, like I said, a convening general conference that would formally adopt those rules. Now the Wesleyan Covenant Association, as I mentioned before, that I'm a part of, they've been working on proposed doctrines and disciplines now for about 4 years, and they have continued their work throughout the pandemic, utilizing that to flush that out even more. So they have everything from a complete and total sort of holistic look at human sexuality and our brokenness in all the ways that we are broken. They've got things about catechesis. How do we train our young people in the ways of the church, and what does that look like? Things about deployment of pastors. Right now the deployment of pastors is kind of a big deal because you all receive me whether you want me or not. I'm grateful that you mostly seem to want me, which is nice because I want to be here. But the bishop decides who goes to the churches. So we are sent to you, but you don't have any say. In other denominations, there's a strict call system where the church sets up a committee and goes searching for a pastor, and they, interview several, and then they call one of their candidates to come be their pastor. That can take years, and sometimes, as we've seen, our Presbyterian brothers and sisters here have been through that process a couple of times since I've been here. And far be it for the Methodists to be the stable ones around here. That's the strange thing. But we have been. But yeah, so there's a lot of differences there. The proposed deployment system in the Global Methodist Church would be some hybrid of those two. So it wouldn't be a strict call system. The denomination would have a lot of aid in finding pastors and potential pastors, but the churches would have more say in who they get, essentially. So there could be obviously some goods and bads there. You kind of have to have a trade-off there. As I've said, people who are in a call system can't imagine being in an appointment system, and people in an appointment system can't imagine being in a call system, and they have their benefits and their drawbacks. So trying to kind of, not both and them, but draw on the wisdom of both to find a way to empower churches more. So there's lots of similarities, but a lot of differences as well. And all of those Wesleyan Covenant documents are available on their website. And if you have trouble finding the Global Methodist Church or the Wesleyan Covenant Association, and you're interested in, again, curing your insomnia, I can point you in the direction of all those documents. Yes, Diane.
You mentioned finances. Did you intend to go over that today too, or is that for another meeting?
No, I intended to kind of get around to that. We had some refresher stuff that we haven't been thinking about for a few years while we've been masking and social distancing. But yeah, so the provision that I mentioned in the discipline, paragraph 2553, spells out the minimum requirements for disaffiliation if you want to, if a congregation wanted to do that. So when all of this came up, I reached out with some colleagues, sort of as a group, reached out to the bishop and the cabinet here in our conference to find out what that would be. We could sort of guess, but we'd just be guessing. So we're like, okay, so we're told in Scripture to count the cost. Let's find out what the cost would be if we were interested in doing something like this. And so I reached out to our conference, and we had a couple of meetings with the bishop and the cabinet and some members of the conference trustees who govern this sort of thing. And we got our number from them, our baseline number. So to put it into perspective, our annual apportionments come to around $36,000 annually, go to cover the cost of annual and general church. So we contribute, it amounts to 13% of our adjusted gross income, for those of you who are interested in this sort of thing. 13% of specific forms of income to the church are contributed to the larger denomination for their work. So the concept is we do things together that then benefit all of us, essentially. At least that's the theory. And so we contribute that, $36,000 roughly annually. So if we were to pay a full year's apportionments plus another year's, that would be, $72,000 for just the apportionment part of it. Then the conference said that the adjusted, or the apportioned part of that unfunded pension liability would be, and I'm forgetting the number exactly, but it was in the neighborhood of like $100,000 and some thousand. And that's based on the total number, so they get a number for the whole conference from our pension program, and that's an estimate based on market forces and stuff. And I'm sorry to say the market is not going in a good way for this sort of thing, for any sort of thing, honestly, right now. But based on market forces, they estimate what the unfunded pension liability is. And then the conferences apportion that to the churches. Our conference has chosen to apportion that based on the clergy salary and housing in my compensation. So they're basing it on clergy compensation. So churches who have like quarter-time pastor, their share of that is much smaller. An average-sized church like we are here, it's sort of middle of the pack. Bigger churches that have multiple pastors, it's more significant. So that's kind of, now there's also a promise that has been made to all of our retirees in the Mountain Sky Conference going back decades, and that is the benefit of a Medicare supplement program for retirees. There's a retiree health care program, and that is also an obligation of the annual conference that they have chosen to apportion to us as well. And I can't remember, it was like 20-some thousand. Basically, it comes out to, if we paid everything I was told we would have to pay, the minimum would be, I think, $230,000. And that's before any other assessments that might happen. So that, well, it gets complicated. So that's the minimum, $230,000 to get out. Now the conference can impose other restrictions and other requirements. Some conferences are reported as requiring up to 50% of the fair market value of your building. So the Cal Nevada conference is requiring that of California churches that want to leave. You can imagine what that bill is. Our conference has not chosen to formalize any extra stuff, so they give us the minimum. But in conversations flushing out their intentions, it's clear that they're not completely comfortable just letting us walk, if that's what we wanted to do with our $230,000 payment. It depends on an assessment for ministry and a potential remnant, as they've called it. So as it was described to me, if there is, it would require any congregation to vote 2/3 of the members present and voting in order to approve a motion to disaffiliate. So 2/3 of the members, any formal member, so we had 3 members join today, you guys could come and vote, so there's your voice. You can come and vote, it would take 2/3 of those members present and voting to be able to move forward with disaffiliation. But that could be 2/3 plus 1, and meaning 1/3 minus 1 could potentially want to stay in the United Methodist Church. And so if there's a significant portion of the congregation that's determined to want to stay in the United Methodist Church, the conference wants to be able to financially provide for a church plant to receive those people, so that they could continue in ministry. So depending on the potential for a remnant and the potential for ministry in the area where the church is, they could ask for some percentage of our building's value in order to allow us to leave. They are also adding provisions that I don't think would be an issue for a church like this, but could be an issue for other churches, like a requirement that you remain a worshiping congregation for 10 years prior to disaffiliate, or after disaffiliating. And if you don't, for whatever reason, and you sell off your assets, the conference would be entitled to a portion of that. Basically, what that's doing, and I'm trying to give you both sides of it here, but what that's doing is it's safeguarding a church from saying, well, we're about to die anyway, because there are churches like this. We're about to die anyway, so let's just disaffiliate, sell our building, and split the money. And one of the things that I've had to grapple with is, and I was sharing this with Rick earlier today, that we sort of operate out of integrity, assuming everybody operates out of integrity, until we recognize that not everybody operates out of integrity. So a lot of the rules, as we talked about a couple weeks ago in the sermon, a lot of the rules that come up are a reaction to people behaving badly. So seeing it from both sides, like, why would the conference need a portion of that if we sell off the church? But there could be churches that do that. I mean, if you sold off a $200,000 building, it might be decrepit and falling down, but you might find some builder who will knock it down for you and make a fortune building some condo on it. There are churches like that in Denver that, barely hold on. They could disaffiliate and then divide the money up among the 15 members that have kept it going, and everybody walk away with a nice little golden parachute. They want to avoid that. Yeah. So that's kind of the kinds of things. So as it stands now, and one of the other things is that the estimate from the pension program is determined on market forces. They take the money that we contribute to the pension program, that you contribute on my behalf and that I've contributed, and they invest it like all pension programs do. And then depending on how well those investments return, then they have a certain obligation of payments to retirees who are depending on that fund. And so there's an amount that's unfunded, essentially. So the better the market does, the smaller our number is. Unfortunately, if you've been paying attention to the stock market, it couldn't go down at a worse time. So we're told that that $230,000 price tag to start the conversation is a current estimate, but that was based on November's numbers from the pension program. And as the treasurer of the conference explained to me in very layman's terms, because I am no investor, the market goes down, our portion goes up. Market goes up, our portion goes down. So you can look at the stock market and see that our portion is probably going to be bigger than that 230 if we wanted to even consider something like this. So a lot of gray area, a lot of question marks there. So Patty. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Who do we?
So let us say you ask for
Uh-huh.
we send them 500,000, 230,000.
Mm-hmm.
Then are we, are we independent? We own the building?
Great question. Yeah. So if we were to go through with disaffiliation under this process, her first question was, who do you write the check to? If someone's willing to write that check, come and see me after church. Just kidding. I'm just kidding. We would pay that portion to the annual conference, and their release of our trust would come upon our final payment of the last negotiated amount, essentially. So if we were to, say, borrow that from the foundation or some other entity or raise it somehow, then we could, then we would pay that to the annual conference. And at that point, we would technically be independent. We could be completely independent and just be us. We also could, and there are very easy ways for us, if we were to do that, to affiliate with the Global Methodist Church and become a part of the Global Methodist Church. And there are even other non-former UMCs, like Free Methodists, other Methodist sort of strains that have started aligning with the Global Methodist Church as well. So there are other Methodist denominations out there as well, but so that's a good question, though. We have a modest mortgage right now. I believe we're about $100,000. I haven't looked at it recently, but I think we're about $100,000 left on it. That's down from, I believe, nearly 4 when I started, and we paid off a large chunk when we sold the parsonage. So we were under 200 when we sold the parsonage about 7 years ago, I want to say, 7 or 8 years ago. And we've been whittling away at it, and I think we're under $100,000, I believe. We have our mortgage through the foundation. The foundation, we actually have a plant. One of our members is on the board of the foundation. And we've already reached out to the foundation. In fact, so has the cabinet, trying to find ways of financing this for churches that want to leave. The foundation has voted to, and they haven't formalized their terms yet or anything, but they're open to loaning, financing churches to be able to do that. Yeah, the foundation is separate of the conference. Mm-hmm. There are some churches who have received grants for ministry and other things that they're being required to pay them back. before they can. So there are other things that don't apply to this congregation that are still factors for some. But and some churches have chosen not to pay their apportionments for months or even years. Some have chosen either because they financially couldn't or because they were doing it out of protest. They have not paid their apportionments. So the fact that this church is up on apportionments is also important in this conversation because that's one less factor. They're requiring churches to catch up to some degree before they can be considered. Mel?
When you spoke earlier, you said there's already the Georgia conference.
Mm-hmm.
70 churches in the southern or the northern
North Georgia Conference. Mm-hmm.
Georgia conference, which seems like a cohesive movement
Mm-hmm.
together
Yeah.
to the global United Methodist Church. How does it appear within our Big Sky conference
Mm-hmm.
or even the Denver area? Do you know the particular feeling, or
Mm-hmm.
would we be Brighton United Methodist Church the only one going to the global Methodist Church
Mm-hmm.
and sitting out here with no other support?
That's a great question. So Mel's wondering, 70 churches seems like a big movement. What would that look like here in the Mountain Sky Conference? The Mountain Sky Conference is a whole other world from the North Georgia Conference. Well, first of all, they encompass just North Georgia, as the name implies. So they're half a state. We are all of Colorado, Utah, Montana, and Wyoming, plus one church in Idaho. So we cover like a quarter of the United States geographically, but we are one of the smallest population-wise of Methodists in the conference or in the general church. So there's a little bit of a weird disconnect there. But estimates of the Mountain Sky Conference, I believe, has somewhere like 350 churches, I want to say, something like that, across those 4 states, plus one in Idaho. And of those, we estimate there might be 12 that might be interested in, and not all of them will be able to or willing to move. So to give you some idea, the gathering of traditional clergy in our conference fits on one Zoom screen if you're a Zoomer, if you're familiar with Zoom. So we're about, I would say about 15 or 16 clergy. So that gives you some idea of kind of, I am a definite minority in our conference when it comes to these things. And I would say traditional churches are in the minority as well. Although it's hard to tell because clergy tend to be more progressive than their congregations too. So depending on the clergy person appointed, it depends. So, John.
Talk about timing a little bit. You mentioned that if the change was to be made, it had to be made before the end of 2024.
2023.
Under the old protocol, it ends in 2023.
Right, yeah, January 1st is the end of it, yeah. Mm-hmm.
January 1st of 2023.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it would have to be done next year.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the question is on timing. The church council would have to send this question to the full church.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, the 2/3 vote. That could happen as early as the spring. Would it be summer or fall next year? That's up to the church council.
Yeah, so John's question is about timing. If we wanted to consider this, what would the timing look like with the provision sunsetting in 2020 at the end of 2023? We would have to have all those payments made and everything, so there'd be a lot of work to do between now and then. There was a timeline put out that would have allowed churches, and I know of at least one church, I think there's probably a couple more, that are planning to disaffiliate at our October gathering of our annual conference. So they're in the works, but timing-wise, that was a very tight schedule. So as John alluded to, the first step would be for the administrative council to vote to consider it and to request a meeting with the district superintendent to do what's called a church conference. You're familiar with the charge conference, maybe? We have a charge conference every year. This would be a church conference, so this would be all the members of the local church. Now, in our case, there's overlap there, but think of a charge as everything a pastor is responsible for. Could be one church, could be 4 churches, versus the church, which would be an individual congregation in the midst of that. So all the members of the local church would be allowed to come and voice and vote. People who are not members could come and voice, but only members could vote, and it would take 2/3. So we don't have a firm timeline on when specifically, but we were told that it would probably be a little bit more stretched out than the timeline that was given if people wanted to consider it for this year, which would have been, I think we'd had to have made that decision by June 10th, I think, something like that, June 15th maybe, yeah, something like that, I can't remember. But that would be a full, let's see, June, July, August, September. It would be 4 months out from the meeting of charge conference. So I'd imagine 5 to 6 months before the next meeting. The next annual conference meeting is going to be in June of 2023. So to have everything lined up for that, we'd probably have to make a decision as a administrative council to explore this by December. And I would imagine that we would start accumulating documents and submitting the required documentation to the conference. They have a whole timeline of things that we'd have to do. And then the vote for the congregation would come, let's see, it was August 1st, so that's like 2 months before. So probably March, I would say. This is just a guesstimate, but sometime in March would have to be the latest that the congregation would take its vote. And then we would enter into negotiations about any additional funds. Now, the congregation could always change its mind. If we voted and they're like, we'd like, 3/4 of your building, and we're like, we can't finance that, then we could change if we wanted to. But that would be sort of the timeline. So the administrative council, our leaders, the leadership council here, they would have to request a vote probably in December or January to happen probably in February, March, maybe early April. And then the annual conference would vote on that petition in June. There is a possibility that, bless you, there is a possibility that they could do a fall meeting of the annual conference to allow churches to consider as well. So there's some fuzziness on that timeline. We don't know for sure. It's kind of we'll have a fall one if we need it. We started doing the fall ones the last couple of years in anticipation of General Conference making a decision in like August or September, and then we would meet in October to respond to that decision, essentially, is the way they were scheduling the way they were. So we had a meeting 2 weekends ago of the annual conference, and then we're having another meeting in October of this year. And that's to consider petitions in addition to the disaffiliation ones. So that kind of gives you some sense of the timeline if it's something that we wanted to explore. Glenda. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, so Glenda's wondering, Glenda's asking if there's any hope or potential for this shift in demographics leading to a sort of reassertion of traditional perspective in the UMC that would kind of allow things to sort of stabilize. Is that fair? The short answer is I doubt it. There's a lot that goes into that, but part of the problem is we had a general conference, a special general conference called, you may remember if you've been Methodist long enough, in 2019. At the 2016 annual or general conference, things erupted and there was talk of splitting. And that was headed off by a call to create this commission that would find, and propose a way forward, so that we could continue as one denomination. And they did their thing, and they brought their proposals to the general conference in 2019, the special meeting. And the 2019 conference rejected any efforts to move the denomination in a progressive way, and reasserted and even strengthened its position on the traditional perspective. That has sort of been that caused a big outcry among progressive Methodists in America, especially, and it really led to a lot of the disobedience and the rule breaking that we've seen in recent years, the last couple of years. So I think we're so far down that path now that just changing the rule book isn't going to affect the implementation on the ground. And that's really the real problem right now in the Methodist Church isn't whether you agree or disagree with different expressions of human sexuality. It's really the church has one position, and the denomination seems helpless to implement and hold accountable to that decision. So you've got people who are trying to be faithful in one area, doing one thing, and people who are trying to be faithful in another area doing a completely other thing and ignoring each other, essentially.
What I kind of see with a lot of this is that there's going to be a lot of young people who might be not wanting to come to the church because they want to go back to the old tradition. The old way of doing things, instead of trying to get it more at the place where kids would enjoy it more, or young adults. It seems like it's out. That would defeat its purpose.
She's talking about demographic shifts in the church, again, in the U.S. Honestly, younger people in our culture aren't coming to church at all anyway. I don't know if resolving this issue will create the room for us to be able to maybe do that more. Part of the problem is we've spent so long fighting about this that people look at you and, why would we want to be a part of that? Because you guys just fight all the time. And you don't follow the rules that are there anyway, so what difference does it make? We'll just go do our own thing. And others are like, well, we need to completely revamp the whole moral system of the church so that other people will feel that they can be a part of it, and we'll get more younger people. And in my experience, that isn't a very effective church growth strategy either. So it's
I don't want to see them displace
yeah.
because of
Mm-hmm.
tradition and stuff.
Yeah, and traditional, these words are sort of stand-ins for much larger concepts. When we talk about progressive and traditional and more of the moral stances of the church as opposed to the format of worship necessarily. We also talk about traditional and contemporary or praise and worship styles of worship. There are churches on both sides of this issue that worship in all of those ways. So one is a stylistic one versus and the Methodist Church is open to lots of stylistic issue, different things like that. But this is more sort of a doctrinal, sort of standard issue. And really, just to be clear, the United Methodist Church is clear that the only restrictions are to the clergy. The clergy. So you asked me if I would do a same-sex wedding. For me, my faith would not allow me, even if the church did. But technically, the church does not allow an ordained clergy person to. I could be stripped of my credentials as a clergy person, theoretically, if I were to do that.
No, I totally understand that. So then, to make it right with people that you cannot marry, if they brought their own clergy in that could do it, would you allow the service to be in the church?
It's by our rule book, it's not allowed to be hosted in our denomination buildings either. Kathy. They are, yeah. So the Wesleyan Covenant Association was formed first as a renewal movement, and then it shifted gears into denominational formation and preparation. Basically, what leaders of the WCA did was they they met with members that seemed pretty clear that a new denomination would probably be needed. So they wanted to be prepared for that. So they met with members. Yeah? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know if I've seen the one you're... Yeah. Yeah, it's a good breakdown there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, the Wesleyan Covenant Association website has a lot of information if you want to know more. And so does the Global Methodist Church website is also growing in its information, which is helpful. But so anyway, the WCA leaders, they met with members of the Episcopal Church, now Anglican. They met with members of churches that went through this with the Presbyterian and some other denominations. And what they learned was that they were not prepared for things when it happened. So they were kind of like building the plane as they flew it, essentially, when everything sort of blew up in their corners of Christianity. And so their advice was be prepared. So the WCA shifted gears pretty quickly into preparation for the possibility of. And so they started work teams to flush out, how we wanted to be different and what we wanted that to look like. It wasn't just that we wanted to be the UMC without this controversy. It's we wanted to be something different. And how do we be something different? So that's what they set out to do. And so they really, for the last, they were founded in 2016. And so for the last 6 years, they've been working toward that. With the launch of the Global Methodist Church, some of the leadership from the WCA that has been guiding that work for the last 6 years have now transitioned into the Global Methodist Church and are taking on leadership roles there. So we have a new president as of this last May. We elected a new president. Our former president is now the chief something or another officer of the Global Methodist Church. He's sort of the head person there now. And the WCA is now starting to shift gears from the preparation for a new denomination to a movement to aid churches that want to leave with how and the resources they need to be able to leave and move into the Global Methodist Church. So they've become more of a facilitator as opposed to a sort of constructor, if you will. So that's kind of the relationship there. So they're not identical, but they are working in concert, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. You guys have been so patient. I know I'm throwing so much at you, and I can't believe it's all in my head until it comes out my mouth. But we couldn't possibly cover everything here. I haven't checked my email yet, so let me do that just to make sure we're not missing some. No, I'm encouraging people to send in questions. Okay, we've got a couple questions from online. Rose from Pueblo, one of our diligent participators in the online ministry. How would current pastors' pension plans be affected by going to the Global Methodist Church? The short answer to that is that Westpath has already agreed and has initiated a pension program for the Global Methodist Church. They will become global sponsors. So the annual conference is a sponsor of our pension program. So the Mountain Sky Conference is my plan sponsor for my pension right now. The Global Methodist Church is already now its own plan sponsor for the same pension. So if, for example, this church were to leave and I were to go with it, my pension, just as an example, would freeze in the UMC here, and I would open a new account under the Global Methodist Church's sponsorship. And then I would end up having 2 half pensions instead of 1 full pension, if that makes sense. So it would be continued in the Westpath, in the same group that manages it right now. I would just have 2 accounts. So that's one question. Would a resolution for disaffiliation have to be approved formally by annual conference? That is another great question, and yes, it would. Every disaffiliating church has to petition the annual conference to approve it. We have had, I believe, 4 or 5 smaller churches that have already left in the last 2 or 3 years. Most of them very small. In fact, all of them very small. One of them hadn't even had an appointed pastor in like 20 years, so very small. But they do have to have a vote of the annual conference. The annual conference hasn't seemed to be in any mood to disagree with that if it comes before them, but it would require annual conference. And would the question of asset transfer be determined by a conference-by-conference basis? I ask this because I'm listening previous annual conferences, Montana Church disaffiliated. They were allowed to keep their building and assets. Yes, so the Montana Church is actually a member of our annual conference, first of all. Believe it or not, way up in Montana, they're related to us. But yeah, it is conference-by-conference basis. So, and it's church-by-church negotiated as well, the way our conference has chosen to set it up. So each church has sort of the baseline, financial obligation if they wanted to leave, and then there may be more on top of that. So it depends church by church, and it also varies conference to conference. So some conferences are making it quite easy for churches. The North Georgia Conference, they paid millions of dollars collectively to get out. I'm not sure where they got all that, but they did. And but they were able to do it rather smoothly. Other conferences are really giving them a hard time. The Western Pennsylvania Conference, I understand, and I don't have any firsthand knowledge there, but so 50% of building from Baltimore, Washington annual conference. So the Western Pennsylvania Conference, which is fairly traditional, their bishop is sort of blocking it and kind of ignoring requests for issues, from what I understand. So it is conference by conference with that. There was one more question that was from Rose. This one is from Sonny Davis. I don't know Sonny. Question about split. Why is it that the traditionalists that believe in the Wesleyan discipline have to walk instead of the progressives that no longer believe in the discipline? So why is it that the traditionalists that believe in the Wesleyan discipline have to walk, quote, walk, instead of progressives that no longer believe in the discipline and want to change it? To me, it's backwards. You would not be the first person to point that out. The short answer is that it's tragic that any denomination would feel the need to split at all. And it's more which side is more fed up with the other is the one that tends to be like, we'll go start something new. So I think it's been years, and this is the thing, is that the traditional perspective on human sexuality has remained the letter of the law in the Book of Discipline for the United Methodist Church. That language was inserted, I believe, in 1972, and it was strengthened several times. Efforts have been made every 4 years at General Conference to remove it or alter it, and it has been reaffirmed every time because of the demographic shifts we've been talking about largely. And